Hello and welcome back to the tale of World War II's maddest lad and the greatest fighter pilot of all time. And the last time we spoke about our hero Marseille, he had been kicked out of the two finest outfits in the Luftwaffe and returned to Berlin in disgrace, having been assigned to Jagdgeschwader 27. And so he joined his new squadron, and again, first impressions were not exactly fantastic. When he arrived, he had a falling out with one of the other pilots, which involved a heated exchange. This resulted in Marseille being grounded for disrespect to a fellow officer. In response, Joachim took the, let's call it measured response, of taking off in his Bf 109 and strafing the ground next to his commanding officer's tent. The only thing that saved his skin from immediate court-martial was the fact that his dad was a general and that he had yet to be assigned to a particular squadron in the wing, and so he was therefore posted to the man best suited to handle this hothead. Gruppe 1 of Jagdgeschwader 27 had a squadron leader named Eduard Neumann. He was a veteran of Spain and an ace, and while he was not the most successful of the aces, his nickname post-war was Mentor to Many. He was a born instructor, but due to the Reich's need for pilots at the front, aces were normally forward deployed to get kills and win battles. It fit in with the Nazis' ideas of winning wars quickly before long-term strategy was needed, something that would end up biting them in the arse, as we know. But such issues were a long way away at this stage. The unit was due to be deployed to support the Italians in their adventures, with Rommel and his Afrika Korps alongside. However, before they could do that, the Germans had to secure their southern flank in preparation for their push into the Soviet Union, and of course, to bail out the Italians who had gotten themselves stuck losing to the Greeks. And so Marseille would fly in support of Wehrmacht operations in Yugoslavia, after the coup in Yugoslavia displaced the pro-German government there. But due to the speed of their victory in Yugoslavia, he didn't get to score any kills. However, while on this expedition, he got to know his wingman, and they hit it off right away, and they made an unlikely pair. Marseille's jaunty flamboyance was the perfect yin to the yang of one Rainer Potkin. He was a calm and reserved man, excellent at teamwork, and it was almost as though Eduard Neumann knew from day one who to put on Marseille's wing. A beautiful friendship and an even deadlier partnership had come about, and the Desert Air Force at RAF headquarters in Alexandria would soon find out just how deadly. But as per usual, for Marseille, it wouldn't be on time. While in transit to their new base in Africa, Marseille's 109 developed engine trouble. Due to this, he was forced to make an emergency landing next to the road between Tripoli and the frontline airbase at Gazala to the east, leaving poor old Joachim to hitch a lift. He found one in the shape of an Italian truck that was en route to Derna, and after talking to the driver, it became apparent that he was going to be late to report yet again. Thankfully this time, though, it wouldn't be his fault per se. Then again, young Joachim had come a long way, both literally and personally. More to the point, he actually really liked his new squadron, and he even liked his new boss. He didn't want to be a pain in the arse like he had been previously. So he decided to kick up a fuss and find some transport. Arriving at the nearest airfield, he went to the sergeant on duty and explained his predicament. As a newly made flight lead, he had to be at his base by tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Otherwise, his squadron will be a pilot down, and that's unacceptable. The sergeant, in typical administration NCO fashion, I'm sure any of you who have military experience will be well aware, immediately referred him to the quartermaster. Once he got there, he asked the QM if he could get a flight, only to be told that there were no transports heading out there for the next 3 days, and that his best bet would be hitchhiking with the Italians again. So, Joachim was right back to square one. It was then that the captain told Marseille, well, buddy, if you want to try your luck, you could always ask General Hellmann to lend you his staff car. He was, of course, being sarcastic, a little joke among soldiers. Had he known just whom he was speaking to, however, he might not have been so flippant, because as soon as he said that, Marseille saluted the Hauptmann at the desk, about-faced, and went to find the general, subsequently finding his office. He was then very soon in said general's office, and relayed his plight. Noting his decorations and the boldness of the young officer to come into a general's office asking to borrow his car, he made a deal. You tell me about your adventures during the Battle of Britain, and promise me 50 kills here in Africa. Marseille, naturally, readily obliged, regaling the general with his 7 kills and maybe one of his less adventurous romantic conquests. Sure enough, that night at 2300 hours or 11 p.m, Joachim was in the back of an Opel Admiral staff car, catching some much-needed sleep. The next morning, he awoke as they pulled up to the Wehrmacht forward headquarters at Deurne to refuel. While there, Marseille decided to get his paycheck organised. Walking into the paymaster's office, he spoke to the NCO on duty to have his paybook stamped. When the NCO went to enter the pay rate for the Iron Cross First Class winner of his rank, Marseille said, "Come on, dude, do me a solid here. Could you bump up my wages this month? You know, those nights in France weren't cheap, man." Seeing his medals, the NCO asked him, looking him dead in the eye, "You reckon you can win a higher honour than that Iron Cross of yours?" Marseille grinned a reply. And so, he got his paybook stamped with a bonus. Man, the charisma of this guy is insane. But it would be his only dub of the day. Due to logistical issues and the distances that the Deutsche Afrika Korps needed to cover, it took a while to get fuel for the car. But once done, Marseille was back on his way. It was 1700 hours, 5 p.m, on April 22nd, 1941, at Gazala Airfield, when Joachim arrived. His squadron mates were not expecting him for another few days given the snarled-up logistics, so when they saw an Opel Admiral staff car rolling up on their command tent, it was dismissed as brass showing up to see the boss, or they're doing a PR tour, they're making a speech, I don't know, just some idiot general or something. Imagine their shock and the looks on their faces when the guest of honour who stepped out of the limo was none other than their friend Marseille. It must have been a sight. He made his arrival known to his direct superior, Oberleutnant Homuth, officially reporting for duty. Once done, he went to meet his gaping-mouthed comrades. Rainer Potkin asked the question everyone was thinking. "How the hell did you get here?" Marseille relayed the story. "Well, you better keep your promise to the general. Men think, but God guides, Joachim." He was finally here. He had a good leader. He had a goal, 50 victories. And above all, he had what all men need. He had the boys. It was time to get to work. The very next day, the 23rd of April 1941, Marseille and Potkin joined the squadron on a sortie over Tobruk, escorting Ju-87 Stukas. Upon reaching the target area, Joachim's superhuman eyesight kicked in once again, and he spotted a group of Hurricanes belonging to 73 Squadron RAF below them. Calling them out on the radio, both he and Potkin dived into the fight. One Hurricane tried to evade Marseille only to overspeed and crash into Tobruk harbour. But maneuver kills didn't count officially in the Luftwaffe, so Joachim shifted targets to another Hurricane. Pulling into a tight turn behind him, he fired, and sure enough, 20mm cannon shells ripped into the Merlin engine, sending the aircraft down in flames. Hans-Joachim Marseille had just scored JG-27's first kill in Africa. "Congratulations, Joachim!" came Potkin over the radio. But he didn't have time to celebrate as the rest of the Hurricanes were now on their tails. Beating a hasty retreat, they returned to base at Gazala to refuel and rearm, with Joachim doing a victory wing waggle over the airfield before landing. They got their aircraft back in order and went out again, encountering 73 Squadron for the second time that day. This time, though, Joachim had made the same mistake he had made over Britain, and picked on the flight leader, only to discover that he was in fact a Free French ace, Lieutenant James Denis, who went on once again to introduce him to a forced landing in Africa. But after being warned of his carelessness by Neumann, he was told to improve himself and get better in marksmanship as well as physical fitness. Again, Marseille got the classic "get your shit together" speech. So, if he was going to fight the entire RAF by himself 1v12, he should at least be physically able to do it. Now, For the sake of brevity, otherwise this series will be over 3 or 4 hours long. It's already long enough as it is. With Potgien covering him and Neumann leading him, Marseille had been given relative freedom of action in Africa. And so what followed was insane. From his arrival to Africa on April 22nd to Jagerschwader 27's return to Germany on December 18th to convert to the famous Bf 109F model, Marseille notched up 29 air-to-air victories, bringing his total to 36. Keep in mind that the Red Baron needed 2.5 years to get to 80, and most of the Eastern Front Luftwaffe aces were fighting Russian aviators who barely knew how to take off, let alone having decent equipment to fly and fight with, and so their scores were inflated. Considering all that, this ratio is flat out bonkers, but I will give you the highlights from this period. On the 13th of September, something Marseille would become famous for doing took place. An Australian pilot, Flight Lieutenant Patrick Byers, was shot down in flames, but he managed to bail out over German lines near Gazala. Upon returning to base, Joachim immediately commandeered a vehicle and drove out to rescue him with first aid and water. Whenever possible, Marseille would rescue the pilot he shot down, or if they were over Allied lines, he would go and let the British know where their pilot was. Anyway, he picked up Byers and noted that he was burnt badly, and so he immediately stepped on it to the nearest field hospital and would not leave until he was told that he would be alright. Marseille ensured to collect his personal belongings and keep them safe, and filled out both his prisoner of war card and his Red Cross card, ensuring that a letter was enclosed to his family. Once this was done, he then returned to base, got back in his 109, and flew over the airbase belonging to his squadron, 451 Squadron RAF, and at great risk to himself, dropped a note to inform them that their comrade was a prisoner and of his condition. Unfortunately, Flight Lieutenant Byers died of his wounds. When hearing this, what did Marseille do? I'll tell you what he did. He got in his 109 again, with Byers' personal effects and a note of condolences, written by him in English, because yes, he could speak and write English, and flew back to the Allied airbase, dropping them off as he flew by. And despite being ordered to stop these flights from Reichsmarschall Göring himself, Marseille would keep doing them, as well as rescuing downed Allied pilots. And he would keep on doing this until his death in 1942. The other incident of note during this period was on the 24th of September, when he achieved one of the hardest feats to achieve in aerial warfare. He scored ace in a day, shooting down 4 Hurricanes and a Martin, Maryland bomber over the day's actions. Unfortunately, over the course of these miraculous several months, Neumann got slightly pissed off at Marseille due to the fact that he kept getting shot up. While he scored a lot of victories, he got them by diving into the entire Royal Air Force and then fighting his way out again. Much like he was doing before in Britain, simulating Albert Ball from World War I. This, of course, meant he was now almost an Allied double ace due to the number of 109s he had written off. This wouldn't be an issue much longer, though, because now he was due to transition onto the Bf 109F, and this beast of an aircraft was to be, for 1942 at least, the king of the sky. And as a bit of personal trivia, it's my favourite aircraft to fly in all of the World War II simulators like IL-2, Aces High, and War Thunder. But not that one anymore, because I don't do War Thunder realistic battles. Anyway, not talking about me, we're talking about someone much cooler. While back home in Germany, Marseille's shenanigans would have continued, but of course, he was now well on his way to being a hero, so he couldn't pull the same nonsense, as I'm sure Neumann had him on a tight leash. But several things did happen. First of all, he had begun training extensively on his physical fitness, even abstaining from alcohol to an extent, which blew the minds of everyone present. The big thing he did do, though, was he had an ab routine that CrossFitters would shudder in fear at. When he wasn't crunching, he was doing sit-ups. The reason for this is very simple. Contracting your abdominal muscles concentrates the blood in your vitals, subsequently preventing blackout in high G turns. This would pay off in a big way. Marseille was also honoured with the German Cross in Gold, awarded to people who had earned a second Iron Cross First Class, but hadn't quite merited a Knight's Cross. Due to its design, the pilots quickly named it the Fried Egg. It was created 2 weeks prior to when Marseille received it, and so he was one of the very first people to get it, which brought him to the personal notice of Hermann Goering, who would follow his career very closely. As the new year rolled around, they celebrated, and Marseille attended a dinner party as the guest of honor. It was hosted by a general in the Wehrmacht who remained nameless in the stories told by Neumann, mainly to guard the secret and safety of our hero. For you see, while at this party, young Joachim met the general's wife, and apparently MILF does not do it justice. Later, when he achieved his 100th kill, she sent him a bottle of champagne, so you can probably work out the rest from there. Unfortunately, the new year would also be met by tragedy. Marseille fell ill while back home. He was absolutely exhausted. He was of a frailer build, remember, and all the exercise, combat stress, and duty while transitioning to the new aircraft knocked him clean out of the fight. So, while on his way back to Africa, he was moved to a soldiers' hospital in Athens, Greece. Joachim there got the news that his sister had been murdered by a jealous lover, and that he had to return home to Berlin immediately. It was for this reason that he would return to his squadron later than everyone else. Marseille was very close to his sister and was absolutely distraught, completely destroying him emotionally. But grieving and recovery, of course, cannot last forever, especially in wartime, and as Jagerschwader 27 and its star pilot would be needed desperately back at the front. And Joachim, quite frankly, wanted the distraction. He wanted to get away from it. The Allies, who now included the Americans, were reinforcing the air forces in Egypt, and at the rate they were going, Rommel would be completely halted due to enemy air supremacy. February 1942 rolled around, and the boys were back in town. They started operations, breaking the new 109s in. However, there was no luck. Nevertheless, Marseille was a new and improved man, so when not on operations, he would log extra flight time training. And so it was on February 8th, 1942, that something incredible happened. Marseille had been out training when he had been given orders to escort a rescue plane. An Italian pilot had gotten shot down somewhere out in the desert, and they needed to go pick him up. Marseille escorted the rescue aircraft, and they completed that mission easily without incident. And so he was currently on his way back for landing at their new airfield at Matruba. At that point, while he was on final approach, the air raid siren went off, and the ground crews started hauling ass, along with the rest of the pilots. But they were way too late on the draw. While Marseille was coming into land, a whole squadron of P-40s had arrived to welcome Jagerschwader 27 back to Africa. Noticing a 109 on landing, they turned in to engage him. But, to use the modern terminology, these P-40 pilots were fucking around. And thus, they were about to find out. What follows is based on and confirmed by multiple eyewitnesses. As Marseille came into land, one of the P-40s opened fire on him. Seeing traces, Joachim acted instinctively and jammed the throttle open while turning to the right, avoiding the rounds and changing the attack angle, forcing the P-40 to overshoot. As this happened, in one movement, he leveled out, raised the gear and the flaps, which in the 109 are hand cranked, and thus he was flying one-handed, and then pulled his nose up. As he did this, while his gear was still coming up, his guns fired. The P-40 burst into flames and hurtled down, impacting the ground. Think about it. On landing, no speed, less than 10 seconds to raise the nose and fire, and he only fired something like 20 rounds. One enemy aircraft down. Getting back up to speed, the 109's engines began its trademarked high-pitched whine as Joachim swung around at another P-40. Having seen what happened to his wingman, he tried to evade, but it was useless. No luck. Marseille fired again, another 20 rounds or so, and sure enough, another 10 to 15 rounds slammed into the wing root of the British plane, severing the entire flight service, leaving him spinning into the dirt. Another P-40, minus its wing, hit the desert floor. That's two. Now the Kitty Hawk squadron coordinated as 3 P-40s swung around from different angles on a mission to avenge their fallen comrades. They had to kill this guy. Marseille pushed the throttle all the way to the wall and shifted the nose down a little, whizzing right over Eduard Neumann's head on his way past. He had pulled an absolutely ridiculous turn. He almost stalled. At low altitudes, you can't get out of that. The British were taken completely off guard and tried to readjust, but it was too late. Marseille fired again, another 20 rounds or so, and whack! The Allison engine on the P-40 disintegrated, sending the Kitty Hawk nosediving into the ground, shattering into a million pieces. 3. After witnessing this feat, Neumann sprinted over to the command trailer and grabbed the phone to the squadron operations tent. It was then answered immediately. "Are you all asleep? How long is Marseille expected to go it alone up there?" "They're already on their way, sir," came the reply, and this was no exaggeration. Naturally, the first in line was Potkin, who, seeing the fight, had started to bolt to his fighter and cranked the engine. 2 more 109s were firing up alongside him. They'd be airborne shortly. Stahlschmidt and Potkin were hauling down the runway as we spoke. Marseille saw them racing across the field and called out over the radio, "About time you showed up, you lazy bastards!" Seeing that reinforcements were now on the way, the British decided that if this was the smoke that the Kraut squadron was bringing, they didn't want any of it. They had ambushed this guy on landing, and he just turned around to wipe out a third of their guys, and now his friends were coming. The P-40s chucked a 180 and ran like hell, but Jagdgeschwader 27 was a little bit on the salty side. By the end of the day, the score stood 10-0 to the Germans. Marseille was so exhausted, he had to be carried from the cockpit to Neumann, who with a wide grin slapped his star pilot on the back. From on final to land to a hat trick in less than 15 minutes. This in of itself is freakish, but what was crazier is that Marseille had been focusing on one particular part of his game more than anything else, and you probably noticed it in my telling of the event. Marksmanship. Throughout that entire fight, he had expended maybe 150 rounds in the whole engagement. In fact, over the course of his career, he would be so accurate, the Luftwaffe High Command would order investigations and interview his armourers to make sure he wasn't bullshitting, but it was confirmed every time. Marseille could take down 5 or 6 planes in one mission, having only used a third of his ammo. Most pilots took half their ammo just to get one. Yet Marseille would be at a 45-degree angle, inverted, in a high-speed dive, while rolling and fire one burst, knocking down his target on the way past, on the first shot. It would be this level of marksmanship that allowed for his more impressive achievements. And speaking of impressive achievements, Marseille, after pulling off this insane feat within his first few days back, goes on a rampage. 4 days later, he shoots down another 4 P-40s. Then a few days after that, he shoots down 2 Hurricanes. Now, 2 Hurricanes doesn't sound that impressive, really, until you hear that he shot the second one down while gliding. After he had shot down the first one, the debris from the kill wrecked his engine, so he had to return to base for repairs. While on the way home, he saw another Hurricane below him and decided, well, I have height, I have ammo, and my prop is still spinning somewhat, so I guess why not? He dives down and takes him out while his engine is literally giving out. He then makes it home doing a dead stick landing. Absolutely phenomenal. And he just keeps going, ladies and gentlemen. He just keeps stacking Allied aircraft at a rate no one can actually believe. It gets to the point that he's taking so many down, his wingman can't get any kills themselves. Before they can get into a good position to attack, Joachim has shot them all down. It gets so intense that as a result, his loyal wingman Potkin, poor guy, became known as the Flying Counting Machine, as his job became the official witness to Marseille's kills. From the 8th of February to the 27th, he scores 16 victories, putting his total to 52. On the 22nd of February, 1942, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring called the airfield of Jagdgeschwader 27 completely unannounced. Everyone in their admin tent immediately dropped everything in shock. Kesselring, the boss, the big man, known as Smiling Albert for his good humour, demanded to speak to Marseille immediately. Joachim answered the phone a few moments later. Lieutenant Marseille, the Fuhrer has awarded you with the Knight's Cross. I congratulate you and hope your soldiers' luck continues. There it was. Germany's first rank of the highest award. He had made it into the big leagues for real now. One of Germany's greatest heroes of the war so far. It also meant he got to go home on leave and pick up his medal. And, given that his comrade, Lieutenant Stahlschmidt, or Lieutenant Stahlschmidt, Jagdgeschwader 27's other big scorer, got the Knight's Cross as well, he could bring a mate with him. And so, time in Germany with one of his best friends and his family, especially after the grief of losing his older sister, was something he most desperately needed, and it's something he most definitely deserved. And as it turned out, it would end up saving the soul of this young aviator. Back home in Germany, Marseille collected his Knight's Cross and took some much-needed time off. He and Stahlschmidt did some old-school carousing. Being a hero has its perks, after all. His star was rising and he was being noticed. As ever, Goebbels' propaganda machine was in full force, fawning over the new hero. In fact, again, this is only a rumour due to the potential scandal, but it is implied that Marseille had managed to get into some of the more trendy establishments in Berlin, and as such he met some of Germany's film starlets of the time, who were very beautiful. For those of you who have seen Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, think Bridget von Hammersmark, the women she's based on and representing in that film. Apparently, our young hero's charms were just as effective on them, though I am sure due to their classiness he had to take turns rather than both at once as per usual. It's even rumoured that he scored with Leni Riefenstahl, the famous director of Triumph of the Will, though we can't confirm that. But then, something happened. Something no one would expect, but when you think about it, and anyone who suffers from being a defensive extrovert, me included, can confirm it, it makes perfect sense. You see, while he is this hard-charging, hard-drinking, hard-fighting, womanizing ace fighter pilot with a lust for glory, there is another side to Marseille, one that his comrades had begun to see, and one which, after the death of his sister, had been brought to the forefront. Hans-Joachim Marseille was an artist, an actor, an impressionist, a classical pianist, a voracious reader, and actually an excellent singer. When he was in Africa, one of his squadron mates, who had a classics degree from Berlin University, and thus I think was nicknamed the Professor, mentioned that there were ancient Roman ruins all throughout their base area. After hearing this, Marseille's face lit up and begged him to come along with them on an excursion and go on an expedition to these ruins, which they did. They went to the ruins of Leptis Manga, climbing through the old Roman buildings, learning the history and hearing stories of Scipio Africanus and his titanic clash with Hannibal, settling the fates of empires, just as they were fighting now. Soldiers in the Legion deciding the future of the world. And as the sun set in the evening over the airbase, the soft sounds of jazz music could be heard wafting through the air, played by Marseille's gramophone. He had bought a huge collection of jazz records in France before the Gestapo could round them up and burn them. The Nazis had labelled jazz and, apologies, but I am quoting here, degenerate gamer music. However, I think you know what word they actually used. But Marseille waged his own mini crusade to preserve whatever jazz record he could find, and he would play them for his squadron. Hans-Joachim Marseille was, beneath it all, a very soft and highly sensitive man who treasured his friends and family beyond anything, and while he revelled in his success, he also felt its vanity and its vapidness. Really what Marseille wanted, what he really wanted, was people to understand him, people to like him, people to care about him. Jagdgeschwader 27 had given that. He had given his friends, the boys. The boys are priceless to any man, all of us can vouch for that. Without them, we're nothing. But even they have their limits. He needed someone who loved him entirely, not the star of Africa, not the debonair and dash of a young handsome fighter pilot. He needed someone to love Joachim Marseille, the boy from Berlin, just trying to fit in. And while walking the streets of his hometown with the beginnings of spring, warming the famous gardens and parks of the Tiergarten, Marseille, the lady-killing, all-conquering fighter pilot who could outdrink any human being alive, would meet a pretty, kind-hearted, and mild-mannered young schoolteacher named Anneliese Kruppe. And from that moment, he had found the one opponent he couldn't vanquish, and for the first time, Marseille decided that this was a battle worth losing. They would go on to spend the rest of his leave time together, and sure enough, as the end of April loomed, beckoning his return to duty, Marseille had realized the same thing that his colleague Eric Hartmann had realized when he met his wife Ursula. This one right here, this one is the one for me. Marseille's Playboy days were finally over, or if not over, just in the decline. But war doesn't wait for love, though the world would be a much happier and much more just a place if it did. Marseille and Stahlschmidt were back with Jagdgeschwader 27 as April came to an end, with Joachim downing 2 more P-40s on his first day back. He would continue to notch up 2 per mission as the siege of Tobruk continued. Rommel was pushing east towards Egypt, and supply lines were getting thin. Tobruk needed to fall so they could get their ships in nearer the front. However, the Anzacs and the South Africans were making life exceedingly difficult by refusing to surrender. Rommel tried several assaults, only for the Aussies and the Kiwis to throw them back. And despite Jagdgeschwader 27's best efforts, the solid supply lines and the Empire Air Training Scheme meant that South African P-40s armed with guns and bombs kept pummeling German convoys. Things were not going well. But the defense, despite its heroic resistance, was beginning to crack. All the Axis needed was one last attack to finally finish it. And flying combat air patrols above these offensive moves was Hans-Joachim Marseille. Rommel was building up for an assault, and the Desert Air Force was trying their hardest to stop it. It was here that Marseille's second most famous fight took place, the 11-minute dogfight. The 3rd of June 1942 was like any other day in Africa around Tobruk. Air operations were fierce and ground fighting even more so. As such, a squadron of Ju-87 Stukas were heading out to bomb the defenders, and by necessity, they needed escorts. Today, Marseille and Potkin drew the short straw. Escort missions suck no matter what the context. Doesn't matter if you're a bodyguard, a pilot, or playing an RPG. Having to protect slow and poorly protected friends instead of hunting enemies is the absolute worst fate for a warrior. Marseille, however, liked these missions, as they forced the enemy to take action, otherwise they would suffer damage, and as such they were more likely to confront them in battle. The 2 pilots met each other before the flight. Marseille was cracking jokes and Potkin was laughing. Sharing the age-old brotherly half-hug, they greeted each other and said, "Break a leg, Rainer. Break one yourself, Joachim." Marseille, having met Potkin and his fighter, moved over to his 109 parked next to it, known as Yellow 14. Once ready to roll, they started up and headed off to meet their charges. Linking up with the Stukas, they greeted their friends in the time-honoured fashion, exchanging waves with the tail gunners. Due to the tactical nature of North Africa, time to target was not very long, and soon the Stukas were on their bomb run. But the Brits were no fools, and their pilots were watching. Knowing that if the dive bombers are about, and they are at their most vulnerable when pulling up after their dives, they would be slow and hanging in space, easy to pick off. And so, right on cue, as soon as the raid began, "Indiana! Indiana! 1,000 meters above us, coming down!" Marseille, as the flight lead, didn't need any telling. He had seen it as soon as they had. Yellow 14 gunned the engine, following Oswald Boelke's most important rule: when attacked at a disadvantage, turn to meet it. A whole squadron, a whole wing of P-40s were diving like the hammer of God upon them, getting ready to smack the Stukas as they pulled out of their dive. The 109s maneuvered out of the kill zone and prepared to set up an attack of their own. The 109's climb rate was just too good for the Warhawks to match, but they knew that too, and they had the element of surprise and the altitude advantage. And as Marseille and his comrades readied to pounce, the P-40s snapped into a perfect defensive formation. The Luftberry Circle. A tight circuit which cuts off an area of airspace while simultaneously ensuring that each fighter can cover their wingman in front. meaning that any pilot dumb enough trying to engage a fighter in this formation would immediately be subject to attack themselves from multiple aircraft. A perfect trap. They had positioned themselves between the escorts and their bombers. Once they shook off the 109s, they could then hit the defenseless Stukas. It was a perfect play for any other day. But not this day. Because this day, their opponent was Marseille. Potgien was right behind his flight lead. The Staffel was hanging back because diving into a Luftwaffe circle, as we've just stated, was a good way to get yourself killed. Marseille, meanwhile, was in a shallow left turn above the enemy formation. It was then he called out over the radio, "I'm going in!" and broke off from his wingman. Potgien, though used to his behaviour, was shocked. This was stupid. This was a dumb play even for that idiot. He'll be in the crossfire of 3 or 4 aircraft if he commits to this attack. Sure enough, Joachim was heading straight into the formation. But what happened next defies belief. In a dive, upside down, in the process of a roll, and an angle going fast enough to shake his 109 to pieces, like the P-40s are in a 90-degree circle, they're in a continuous bank. There are about 7 or 8 different angles. Essentially, Marseille had to calculate his aim at double the normal speed across 3 different spatial axes in the middle of an enemy formation while upside down. The first P-40 went up in flames on the first shot as Joachim zipped through the formation. At the same time, his 20mm cannon jammed, most likely due to the fact that he was pulling high Gs during the attack. Given this, he only has 2 rifle-caliber machine guns left. This would normally be an abort mission scenario. But again, say it with me. This is Marseille. He pulled out of the dive and then zoom climbed back into the formation and fired again. Down goes another P-40. And he kept going. In and out of the formation, firing single bursts, and as the P-40s were in a defensive circle, they couldn't break the formation, because if they did, the rest of Jagerschwader 27 are up top, and they are positioning themselves for that very eventuality. They're waiting for that formation to break. Once it breaks apart, the rest of the 109s can kill them all. Still, in disbelief at what they were witnessing, over the next 10 minutes, 4 more P-40s were knocked out of the sky, breaking up the formation and leaving them to the mercy of all the 109s. Joachim called out to his wingman, "Did you get a count, Potgien?" "All 6 accounted for, Joachim. Bravo!" The Desert Air Force took a horrific beating that day. Half of it due to Marseille. The Stukas got away safely, and upon their return to the base, there was a hero's welcome. But the mechanics were confused. They were puzzled. They weren't sure how it was possible. His 20mm had jammed, and the armorers were busy fixing it, and yet it can't be. This can't be right. In the course of this engagement, 6 enemy aircraft were confirmed destroyed. Cannon out of action. 1 man versus like 15 planes. Total number of rounds expended? 360. 360 bullets for 6 planes. Only 10 of those rounds being cannons. 350 machine gun rounds across 5 aircraft. Incredible. Insane. Impossible. But it was confirmed. It was true. And this kicked off an incredible 2 weeks. Over the next 14 days, Marseille would score another 20 kills. And as though he was showing off, he ended it with another ace in a day plus 1, totaling 26 kills between June 3rd and June 17th. The reason this was showing off is that his second 6-day kill put him at 101 kills in total. And as a result, on the 18th of June, a telegram from Luftwaffe headquarters came through, forwarded from none other than the Reichskanzlei. By order of the Führer of the Greater German Reich and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, Adolf Hitler, Oberleutnant Marseille is awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and is ordered to report to Berlin as soon as he is able to receive the award from the Führer personally. Here it was. A career-defining moment. However, as it would turn out, it would also be a life-changing one, as Marseille would be forced to confront the faces of the regime he fights for, and the results of those encounters would not endear him to the establishment, and most definitely vice versa. Landing at Tempelhof Airport, there was a news crew to record the event, and banners were hoisted high, welcoming Marseille the hero. All Berlin is proud of him. Joachim hopped down from the Ju-52, not in the expected dress uniform, but in a tropical African uniform, complete with his non-regulation scarf and a tatty suitcase. He did indeed cut quite the rakish figure. After meeting the press, he walked to the terminal to meet his fiancée and his mother, both of whom were more concerned for his welfare than his deeds. Like most soldiers, Marseille's reaction, despite having experienced it briefly before, was nothing short of culture shock. War in the desert is brutal, the conditions unforgiving, and the battle relentless. So the air-conditioned terminal building with a cafe, being greeted by his loved ones, having just the day before being engaged in mortal combat with an entire squadron of RAF fighters, was disorientating. Going to the newsagents in the airport foyer to get the daily newspaper, he saw the front page featuring a story of Marseille, Germany's newest member to the Pantheon of Heroes, the 12th winner of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. To the puzzlement of his future wife, he was falling about laughing. Me, a hero? That's a good joke. But of course, time was a factor. He could only stay with his family for the afternoon, as tomorrow he would meet the Führer himself. And he had to get his uniform looking somewhat presentable before then. So, hitching up his bag, they went to catch a cab back home, which ended up costing Marseille a packet of cigarettes because once the cab driver realised who it was in the back seat, he refused payment of the trip. Marseille, being Marseille, couldn't accept not paying and so left him a pack of smokes in the back seat. With a freshly cleaned and pressed uniform, Joachim hopped a train in the company of several members of Luftwaffe General Staff. Destination, Rastenburg, the Führer's headquarters located in East Prussia. And before long, he was standing in front of the man himself, the one responsible for all that had transpired in Marseille's adult life. After shaking hands and receiving his award, they sat down for lunch, noting Hitler's choice of a vegetarian meal. The conversation revolved around the situation in Africa, Rommel's triumph at the siege of Tobruk that week, and the future plans for that front of the war. It was rather impressive to Marseille just how knowledgeable the Führer was about the various technical details and the interesting little factoids he could weave into a conversation. After lunch, Hitler pulled Marseille aside. Adolf Galland, General of the Fighters, was standing to one side. Given that this was a Luftwaffe function and the hero was one of his men, he overheard the exchange. Hitler asked Marseille candidly about the situation in Africa regarding the air war. Hitler often did this because quite intelligently he didn't believe a word of what Goering, Bormann and Keitel had been telling him. But I don't think Hitler anticipated how candid or direct Marseille is. Marseille responded, and this is according to Adolf Galland, and I quote, "I'm no expert, but whoever the Allies have running their logistics, we need to hire him. They're clearly better than us." Taken aback by this, Hitler said nothing for a moment. No one speaks to him that way. After collecting himself, he thanked Marseille for his honesty and wished him luck. They would meet again later during his leave. From this event, Marseille was then booked out for dinner with the General Staff. Reichsmarschall Goering had invited them to his estate at Karen Hall in the coming days, followed by a meeting with the Goebbels family. So to say his schedule was packed would be an understatement. At dinner that night, it was of course dress uniforms and full regalia. At the dinner were a large collection of Luftwaffe senior staff, but also other branches. This was a different dinner to one with Goering, by the way. And they weren't the only ones there. The SS and even local political leaders were there too. After all, he was the guest of honor, and as a national hero, people naturally wanted to meet him. Dinner began with champagne flowing freely among the guests, and one of the officers asked Marseille about his meeting with Hitler, and what it was like. Marseille replied, and I quote again, "I must admit, the Führer is rather an odd sort." Yes, this man was bad-mouthing Hitler at dinner with the German High Command and the SS. Think about that for a second. The conversation immediately died out at that moment. As I said, there were SS men present. So, quickly, the topic was changed and the evening went on. Now, that should have been the warning not to discuss politics. It would be a bad idea to discuss politics with Marseille here. It was apparent that Marseille did not exactly have a high opinion of the regime or much interest in politics in general. But Luftwaffe General von Below moved the discussion back that way. "So, Marseille, you're a hero and you have wit and charm. Have you ever considered, maybe after the war, a career in politics? Maybe even, perhaps, joining the party?" Marseille responded calmly. "If there was a party worth joining, I'd consider it, but there would have to be lots of pretty girls in it." Galland immediately stepped in with a quip to defuse the situation, but Joachim's remarks were noted. So let's just back this up a second. He had insulted Hitler and, by inference, called the Nazi Party not worth joining. And he had done this in the presence of half the High Command and a group of senior SS officials. There are a lot of fucks in this world, and Marseille, clearly as we know, does a lot of fucking. But Hans-Joachim Marseille gives precisely none of them. At all. There are no fucks that this man gives. My only theory as to why he didn't get himself shot is made evidence in his activities later that week, meeting his commander-in-chief. He met Hermann Goering for yet another Luftwaffe lunch, but he arrived early on request of the Reichsmarshal himself for a private meeting. Goering was dressed in his game warden attire, and fun fact, Hermann Goering's hunting laws are still in place in Germany today. And he took Marseille round the estate in his hunting horse-drawn buggy. And while doing that, he chatted to him about the conditions at the front, the aircraft, the fighting, and what he could do to influence the situation. Now, Hermann Goering was a terrible leader, a creator of the Gestapo, an organizer of genocide, and a drug-addicted narcissist whose lies, overconfidence, and political posturing in denial of reality got a lot of good men on both sides of this war killed. But all of this he may be, he was nevertheless a soldier at heart. He joined a Prussian regiment the moment he was old enough, fighting in the infantry and later joined the German Air Service, winning the Pour le Mérite for his 22 victories, and taking command of Richthofen's Flying Circus during the final months of World War I after the Red Baron died. He was a fighter pilot. He was a jovial charmer and the life of the party, and he was the embodiment of the old-school World War I flying ace persona, much like his friend Ernst Udet was. Marseille was a young man who he identified with to a degree that not many people really could. And Joachim, for his part, felt the same way. His friendship with Goering would save his ass from investigation regards the matter of a general's wife, and it would also cover him for things he would do later. When having lunch with him, while other figures like Galland were watching on, Goering turned to Marseille and asked, "So how many conquests does that make for you, Marseille? 101, I think?" Joachim, despite being engaged, gave a typical Marseille response. "Herr Reichsmarschall, do you mean enemy aircraft or women?" Apparently, Goering almost choked with laughter. Personally, if he had died from said choking, that would have been Marseille's greatest victory, but we aren't that lucky. Later that day, he had coffee with the Goebbels family. Where the poisoned dwarf discussed business regarding a tour he was to do for the propaganda ministry, specifically speaking to the Hitler Youth Gliding Clubs, all aspiring Luftwaffe officers, obviously. Marseille was looking forward to it. He didn't very much like Goebbels or his propaganda goons, but he enjoyed meeting kids like him who wanted to fly. The start of this tour was to happen in Berlin, which gave him an opportunity to head back home to his fiancée and his mother. When he got back, he had to get to work, but before that, he wanted to do something normal for once, and so, seeing as Anneliese was teaching that day, he took his mother to the movies. Sitting down in the middle of the theatre, the loud, blaring music of the Deutsche Wochenschau came over the speakers, showing the latest triumphs of the Wehrmacht in the field. German troops were sweeping the Red Army aside in their latest offensive. They were heading to a city on the Volga River named Stalingrad. Though it seemed like that city, much like Tobruk, would fall despite the enemy's best efforts. It then transitioned to the Western Front and the exploits of Jagdgeschwader 26 on the Channel Coast. It showed 109s doing flybys and dashing Luftwaffe officers. It then showed gun camera of an attack on a Spitfire. Tracers started flying past and going wide, then falling short. He was shooting erratically. The pilot shooting was not a very good shot, evidently. Without thinking, Marseille jumped to his feet and yelled at the screen, "Hold your fire, you idiot! Wait for your moment!" It was then someone in the back row yelled at him, "What would you know about it, kid? You're no Marseille!" Realizing what he'd done, Joachim sat back in his seat. His mother looked at him smiling while he was cackling with laughter, trying to hold it in given the surroundings. After that, his trip home resumed its business character, and Marseille speaking to her around the various Hitler Youth gliding clubs. He regaled them with tales from the front, and despite his ego, he did ensure that his comrades all got a mention, especially Neumann, Potgin, and Stahlschmidt, without whom, he told them, he wouldn't be here to tell them these stories. He even told them stories of the enemies he'd met, and their heroism in battle, taking their struggles down to the wire. Marseille, as we know, was quite the storyteller. While he was doing this, he attended appearances at local functions and parties, and apparently he and his fiancée made quite the impression on more than one occasion. It was then that Joachim was invited to spend the day with none other than Willy Messerschmitt. There was a party laid on for the Nazi elite at his home that evening, and given that the star pilot of Germany was invited, why not meet him earlier in the day? Marseille arrived at the Messerschmitt testing airfield to meet the man who built the aircraft on which he had in turn built a career. He reported the performance of the 109 F and G series as it was performing in the field, its strengths and its weaknesses, improvements needed, as well as the myriad of bugs in the G model. With that done, it was then that Messerschmitt showed him the latest model of 109. This was one of the airframes testing the newest and latest prototype of the DB605, as well as being a test bed for what would become the 109 G10. Upon seeing this aircraft, Marseille didn't even think twice. "Can I have a go?" "We'd be honoured," came the reply, and so, with his trademark cheesy grin, Joachim immediately climbed in and took off. He then proceeded to beat up the airfield, doing aerobatics which made Messerschmitt flinch at the thought of his precious test aircraft being destroyed. Of course, there was absolutely no danger of that happening, as he beat up the airfield with an incredible aerobatics display, much to the applause and cheers of the people watching. He then safely touched down, and the entire ground crew and engineering staff cheered enthusiastically as he briskly hopped out, his trademark ostentatious scarf well and truly on display. "Now I know who I am giving this plane to," said Messerschmitt's chief test pilot Fritz Wendel in admiration. But the sun was getting pretty low in the sky, and so the chief fighter designer and the Star of Africa were required at the party. After all, it wouldn't be good if an honoured guest and the host didn't show up. The party went reasonably well. The guests mingled and chatted. However, Marseille was kind of out of place. Social butterfly he may be, but everyone here was way older than he was. The only ones close to his age were the adjutants there to look after their masters. They're all bureaucrats. None of them are really soldiers. They're all desk pushers and men in uniforms running, I don't know, something like a bizarre business. The military-industrial complex at work. These are all industrial magnates and senior SS officials. He hovered around the different groups, and it was there that he happened upon a conversation that made his blood run cold as ice. Days ago, the Butcher of Prague and host of the Wannsee Conference that started the Holocaust, the final solution to the Jewish question as they put it, Reinhard Heydrich, had been assassinated in Czechoslovakia by a group of absolute heroes from the Czech wing of the SOE. I should make a video about that someday. Anyway, the SS were currently conducting reprisal operations in response to the murder of their leader. But not only that, they also accelerated Operation Reinhard, the mission to exterminate all Jews in Poland and to increase deportations out of the Reich. This was tied into the construction of Sobibor, Treblinka, and of course, Auschwitz-Birkenau. The details of these operations, including figures, policy, numbers killed up to that point, and ongoing deportations, were being discussed by Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff, Himmler's adjutant, and Ludwig Globocnik, I believe that's how you pronounce it, an Austrian Nazi Himmler had put in command of the operation in Poland. Marseille overheard the entire conversation, and his reaction was one of horrific disbelief. Being a kid from suburban Berlin and being in the middle class, not to mention being an arts man, the fact was, growing up, half of his friends and his family doctor were Jewish. Wolff noted Marseille listening in and his troubled expression and wondered if he should maybe talk to him about it and what they were discussing. But he wouldn't get an opportunity, as it came to the Führer's attention that Marseille was a classically trained pianist and requested that he put on a performance on the grand piano in the lounge. Naturally, you don't say no to the Führer of Germany, and thus he took his seat. And there they were. The SS, Goebbels, Bormann, Hitler, the entire German hierarchy, essentially, was sitting opposite. Every major Nazi in the Reich was right there. Their request was simple. Beethoven and Wagner. Because of course it would be. And so Marseille played. Hitler was enjoying it. Transported by the music, Joachim was exceptionally talented. He went through Für Elise, the Moonlight Sonata, and on to Wagner's Flight of the Valkyries and the Ring Cycle. Now, picture this celebration of German culture. Hitler's favourite music, the entire leadership of the Reich and their families watching on. So, when getting ready to switch to the next movement, the next part of this grand celebration of German culture, he's playing Bach, Beethoven, Wagner, he's playing all of the classics. What does Marseille do? During the middle of this performance, at the point where a crescendo ends and it moves into the next phase, this absolute madman breaks out into the most aggressive, and I'm sorry, there is no other way to put it, the blackest New Orleans jazz you have ever heard in your life. This man went off. He played Scott Joplin. He played everything. He was going insane. Ragtime, boogie woogie. He just blew the house down. Remember, they had banned jazz for being degenerate gamer word music. And here he is, playing ragtime and boogie woogie in front of Hitler and Goebbels. When he finished, Hitler stood up and said, "We've heard enough." Magda Goebbels thought it was funny. Everyone else, though, I think, caught the subtext. This was, as far as everyone could tell, a form of protest. The party began wrapping up after that, and so the Führer began singing off the guests. And as per protocol, Marseille said his goodbyes. He had essentially just told Hitler to go fuck himself. Really? And yet, surprisingly, Hitler asked to have a private conversation with him. The contents of that conversation are unknown, but as Joachim was leaving, this exchange was overheard. "Stay safe, young man. Germany will need you after the war." Marseille turned and replied as he was leaving, "I don't think, mein Führer, any of my comrades or I will live to see the end of this war." It would turn out to be a rather prophetic remark. Over the next few days, Joachim went around his neighbourhood and the local government offices, asking about his friends from school, only to be met with awkward glances and no answers. His family doctor had gone too. All of his Jewish friends had disappeared, and unlike most Germans, he knew then what had happened to them. The effect on him could not be understated, and it would trouble him for the short remainder of his life. He spent time with his fiancée and his mother trying to cope with the situation, and it was then that he found out he was to be honoured by Mussolini, given that his service was primarily in assistance to the Italian forces in Africa, and he was to be honoured with the Medaglia d'Oro, the gold medal for military valour. Given that meant a trip to Rome, he wrangled permission for his fiancée to come with him, and so, as the second week of August began, they set off to Italy. And it was a very romantic trip, where the couple deepened their relationship. But of course, duty called, and on August 13th, Marseille and Anneliese greeted Mussolini for the award ceremony. The fanfare played out and the medal was awarded, along with the traditional Italian cheek kissing. Marseille said of this to his comrades later that it was rather unpleasant, given that Mussolini had shaved very poorly. When the official duties were complete, Marseille and Anneliese toured the city, visiting monuments and art galleries and famous exhibits of Rome itself. And it was then that Joachim pulled a stunt that he almost got in real trouble for. After the revelations of the Holocaust, the oppressive celebrity, and the overall distaste for the war, he and Anneliese went AWOL. They disappeared into the world's most famous city, to the extent that the Gestapo was forced to investigate his whereabouts. Eventually, most likely to preserve his future wife's safety and, of course, that his comrades were still at the front, the couple reappeared, and he set off to Africa to join his friends in Jahrgeswalde 27. Anneliese caught a train back to Germany. It had been a fairy tale holiday in the middle of a horrible, horrible war. But the problem with reality is that it almost never has a fairy tale ending. Upon returning to Africa, it was noted by his comrades that Joachim was in a far more serious, tight-lipped, and grim state of mind. 2 of his friends had been killed in action while he was on leave. The revelation of his nation's activities, while leaving his fiancée on a train back home, had done nothing but enhance that agony. However, this was soon to be offset by the beginning of a close, yet ultimately fleeting friendship. After the fall of Tobruk, prisoners of war had been taken by the thousands, and among them was a South African contingent with black soldiers and white officers. Now, while minority troops were often discriminated against and treated very badly by German units for obvious reasons, the fact of the matter was the Wehrmacht in Africa did not have the same concentration of Gestapo and SS that you would find on the Eastern Front or even in the West. This, combined with the influence of their commander, as well as the uniqueness of the particular troops in question, resulted in something different. The South Africans, as I'm sure most people viewing this know, have a very poor history with their treatment of their native countrymen. I mean, all of us post-colonial countries do, but South Africa was particularly bad. The apartheid system was ruthlessly in place at this time, as it would remain for the next several decades, and as such the African troops did not particularly like their colonial masters. This resulted in a few cases of something very similar to the Heavies on the Eastern Front. Citizens of the exterior regions of the Soviet Union, mainly Ukraine and the Baltics, who joined the Wehrmacht due to the horrific treatment of those regions by Moscow. A situation where the Germans would take on members of what they perceived as an inferior race to assist in rear echelon duties, cooks, cleaners, drivers, secretaries, etc. One of these South African rear echelon troops was named Matthew Letulu, who had been assigned as a driver to Jahrgeswalde 27. He had become known in the squadron as Matthias. Upon his return, Marseille had to get chauffeured around to get everything straightened out, and Matthias was given the job of chauffeuring him. The two hit it off right away, and the moment they got back to headquarters, he asked Neumann to have Matthias assigned as his Batman, an enlisted man responsible for handling an officer's affairs while he's off flying. Their friendship would develop rapidly. Some days, Joachim would be so wiped from flying multiple missions, Matthias would lift him from the cockpit. He also acted as the bartender for the squadron when they held parties. He was much loved by the men of Jägerschwader 27. However, the Star of Africa was a German hero, and as such, higher commanders, when visiting the squadron, would make note of his friendship with Matthias and criticize Marseille for this association. But in this instance, they had made a grave miscalculation. No matter the rank, if anyone, and I mean anyone, mouthed off against Matthias, Marseille would confront them directly. He had to be restrained on at least one occasion. Knowing the dynamics, it was most likely Potkin, given he was usually Marseille's wingman, and I'm guessing Neumann had him assigned as his, handler, shall we call it. It was these instances that caused Joachim to do something very courageous, and something that inadvertently led to some of the most extraordinary events later, well after his death. After the racism directed towards his friend from higher-ups got too severe, he asked to speak to Neumann. He then began to tell Neumann everything he had learned in Berlin regarding the SS's activities and the ongoing process of the Holocaust, so far as he knew them. And as a result, he asked Neumann as a friend and his commanding officer that if anything should happen to him, that the squadron would protect Matthias with their lives. Neumann found this impossible to believe, as did his comrades, and yet, Marseille, of all the people they knew, was the most honest man in the world, and if he heard this, and he was in a position to hear it given that he met with the Führer and senior SS officials, and his father was a general, as horrific as it sounds, he had to be telling the truth. Neumann promised Marseille that Jägerschwader 27 would look after Matthias at all costs, as a member of their unit. But more than that, Neumann would inform his colleagues of the things Marseille had said. Later, as the war went on, long after our protagonist had gone, Neumann and the other officers of the Luftwaffe, Mackie Steinhoff, Hannes Trautloft, Gunther Lutzow, among others, would be promoted to senior command positions, and knowing of this activity, along with Galland, who, knowing Milch was aware of the slave labour used to build their aircraft, caused a small resistance effort among the senior fighter leaders. This went to the extent that when Hannes Trautloft, who was inspecting Luftwaffe factories building fighters, found prisoners of war among the concentration camp inmates, who alerted him that prisoners were being murdered by the SS, he stormed the commandant's office, called Luftwaffe headquarters to alert them of the situation, threatened the commandant on pain of death that no further prisoners be harmed, and then he left, only to come back with trucks and a whole battalion of Luftwaffe ground troops to move all of the prisoners of war in the camp to Luftwaffe custody. When I read this story and confirmed it, I was in disbelief, but Neumann, Galland, Steinhoff, all of them confirm it in their memoirs and interviews, as do the prisoners of war that Trautloft rescued. Marseille, in his own small way, indirectly contributed to saving the lives of Allied airmen who were subjected to the Holocaust. This alongside the many wounded and stranded Allied airmen shot down in Africa that he rescued or arranged for the rescue of personally. And of course, he ended up saving the life of his friend Matthias, who, following their promise to Joachim, the men of Jägerschwader 27 protected him for the entirety of the war in Africa. And once the Allied offensives began to materialize, and the regime began to turn more brutal, the squadron smuggled Matthias into a prisoner of war camp to be liberated by the Allied forces, who did so after the fall of Tunisia. Once the war ended and it was discovered that Matthias had survived, he was invited to all of the pilot reunions of Jägerschwader 27 and the Luftwaffe Fighter Pilots Association, and he would attend until the death of its members over the passage of time. Marseille, with everything else going on, decided that the only way was to just keep going. He was going to throw himself into his duty to cope with the stress and the loss of his friends in combat due to his absence. And this made him vow to protect his comrades, to fight harder than he had before. It was this feeling that drove him on September 1st, 1942, when he achieved what is widely considered the most impressive feat in the history of air-to-air combat. On this day, like all days, Jagdgeschwader 27 was slated to provide cover for the Stukas hitting British positions on the front line during the ferocious First Battle of El Alamein. The RAF would give them a warm reception, with 16 Hurricanes and Spitfires swooping in on the bombers. Marseille, having spotted them early, immediately attacked the Hurricanes, destroying 2 of them in as many minutes, having shot one down from low 6 and then diving down on the other. It was then, at that moment, 2 Spitfires came roaring in down on the 109s. They had been waiting just for this moment, but it was their misfortune. While Marseille's younger wingman, Potkin was assigned to another pilot that day, dove to get some speed, Joachim cut speed and turned into the RAF fighters at the last moment, forcing them into an overshoot. Once there, he immediately blasted one of the Spitfires as they went by, only to see one more going down after the Stukas, which had just dropped their bombs. Diving in on this last Spitfire, the enemy did not have a chance in hell, as Marseille blasted him with a full burst, setting him on fire. Much to the relief of everyone concerned, however, the pilot managed to bail out and his rescue was called for. Returning to base, Marseille waggled his wings 4 times and then came into land. And once again, the armourers confirmed in their reports, in disbelief, that he had only used 80 cannon rounds and 240 machine gun rounds in total, less than a third of his ammo. This was useful, as it meant reloading time was cut down, as they were needed airborne again as soon as possible. Another flight of Stukas was heading out to support the advanced units of Rommel's force, who were bloodying themselves on the British lines in an ultimately futile attempt to break through to Egypt. Marseille and his flight quickly launched again, and by late morning they were over the front lines once more. It was then that a rare but deadly occurrence happened. One bombing raid met another. The Stukas heading in on their target encountered a flight of bombers from the Desert Air Force, now striking advancing German tank columns. The problem with this is that bombers in a tactical scenario are almost always escorted. 30 P-40s were sitting above the bombers, and upon sighting the Germans, an almighty furball broke out. Absolute chaos reigned. In order to maintain cohesion, a squadron of 8 P-40s formed another Luftbury circle, but as we've seen before, when up against Marseille, this isn't a defense, it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. Initiating contact at 10:54, he proceeded to shoot down 6 P-40s out of this formation. Once this was done, he zoom-climbed back up to altitude, only to spy the other flight of P-40s, who, with their escort mission being completed, were returning to base. He reversed course and dove back down into the fray, knocking down one in a single burst. His wingman, meanwhile, damaged another but couldn't quite finish the job due to a steep angle of deflection. Marseille had no problems here. He whipped around on the wounded enemy plane, split Est into a 6 o'clock position, and fired one short burst. This ended the fight. Marseille returned to base, and to the incredulity of Neumann and everyone present, Joachim waggled his wings 4 times, looped back over the field, waggled them another 4 times, and then did a victory roll before coming into land. From 10:54 a.m. to 11:04 a.m. 10 minutes. Marseille had shot down 8 enemy aircraft. The Italians, who shared this base with the Germans, having listened to the fight on the radio set, acquired a Kübelwagen car from their squadron leader and painted Otto on the side, Italian for 8, and donated it to Marseille in honour of his victory. Neumann walked up to Joachim, now being carried from his aircraft by Matthias. "You'll get the diamonds for that, Joachim. Outstanding job. Now you're ordered to get some rest. Get inside." He did just that. He grabbed lunch and then passed out in his tent while Matthias guarded the door to ensure no one came in and woke him up. Now you would hope that this is the most incredible part, right? Wrong. Because after his nap, Joachim woke up to the sound of engines being turned over and aircraft being rearmed for the evening's flights. And to the absolute astonishment of everyone, Neumann was concerned for his health and his sanity at this. Marseille put himself on the flight roster for the evening's mission. Flying out with the Staffel, the squadron listened as Marseille commanded the rest of his flight to keep up with him. It was then that he sighted the enemy, who were closing in to meet the Germans head-to-head.
It turned into yet another gruesome dogfight. Tooth and nail, knife fighting from altitude all the way to the deck. But the Staffel knew their leader's style, and formed a tag team wingman arrangement where they would all just focus on keeping Joachim's tail clear. They themselves scored victories doing this, but what it also allowed to do was for Marseille to engage the enemy at will from inside their own formation. Once again, the Star of Africa just begun tearing enemy aircraft down, one after the other, and yet again, in the span of 6 minutes, Marseille had scored 5 more victories, leaving his total for the day at 17 kills. Think about that. Most fighter pilots only ever get like 2 or 3 kills in their whole career. Really talented pilots in the thick of combat average maybe 50 or 60 over their career. Marseille had shot down 17 in the space of 3 missions in a single day. Only one other pilot managed to surpass this, and that was on the Eastern Front across a whole day against a mixture of bombers and obsolete Russian fighters. Marseille did this, all against modern fighters, all against the RAF, with most of them being within 2 hours. Truly insane. No one has ever achieved anything like this level of dogfighting prowess before or since. The man is a real-life Ace Combat pro tag. It's ridiculous. Marseille's success did indeed warrant his award for the Diamonds to the Knight's Cross, but something remarkable occurred, which we will discuss later. But if one thinks he was going to take it easy after this, you would be very, very mistaken. He just kept going, scoring ace in a day on the 2nd and the 3rd of September. That's 28 kills in 3 days. Essentially, if Marseille flew a sortie and met the enemy, several of them would meet their end with certainty. And this kept going. It kept going until the 15th of September, where he scored another 7 victories in a single day. But he got slightly in over his head in one of the fights, and ended up taking damage to his landing gear, and thus needed to belly land his 109 on return to base. As he did this, he wasn't watching his vertical speed indicator, and he hit the deck way too hard, spraining his arm inside the cockpit from the impact. By now, his tally was 151 kills. After climbing out of the aircraft and seeing the dock, Neumann grounded Marseille on medical grounds, which is absolutely the correct decision, by the way. However, Joachim took this with his usual grace. But given the circumstances, there was not much he could do to argue. It's not like he could punch him, or anything at all, really. It was then that the phone rang. Neumann answered and passed the receiver to Marseille. It was Field Marshal Rommel's adjutant, and he was asking him to report to the Deutsche Afrika Korps headquarters to meet the boss. Marseille immediately said that his condition was he wanted to bring the boys, which of course Rommel agreed to immediately. Joachim, Potgin, and the lads loaded up in his Kübelwagen Otto and drove to Rommel's field headquarters. And sure enough, there was the Desert Fox himself. He congratulated Marseille on 150 victories and thanked him for his service that he and his comrades had performed in service of the Afrika Korps. He then talked to the pilots, meeting each one of them, before returning to the business of preparing for the inevitable British counterattack now that his offensive at El Alamein had failed. It was then that one of Rommel's staff mentioned to Marseille, "You know, he just got back from the front line 10 minutes before you arrived, and he made sure to put his dress uniform tunic on to receive you. I've only ever seen him do that once before." After this meeting with the Desert Fox, the boys headed back to the airfield, and Joachim began his exile on the ground. In any case, wincing from the pain of his arm, Joachim wandered around the airfield, listening to jazz, the Rumba al Zul being his favourite jam of the time. But one can only kick rocks and read books for so long before one goes stir-crazy. On the other side of Jagiellonista 27's airfield was their friends in the Italian Regia Aeronautica. So Marseille decided, fuck it, and he went over to have a chat to them. While talking to the Italian ace Emanuele Annoni, he asked how their Macchi C202s were going versus the later models of Spitfire. And then a thought occurred. The Italians aren't in Jagdgeschwader 27, obviously, so they didn't get the orders of the day. So they don't know I'm grounded. The old Joachim had resurfaced with a vengeance for one last hurrah. Marseille tactically acquired Emmanuel's plane and then took off to perform an airshow over the field. He wanted to try out the Italian fighter, as every pilot wants to try a new plane. He took off with precision and raised gear and flaps. This done, he picked up speed and turned to do a high-speed pass over the airfield. But he had forgotten something. Despite being conscious of it for takeoff, he was now in pilot mode, meaning he was acting on instinct and reflex rather than conscious thought. And as such, he forgot that the engine controls of the Macchi regarding throttle, pitch, and mixture and all that sort of thing were reversed from his 109. And so, in the motions of starting this show, he suddenly turned the engine off like a moron and crash-landed on the field, wrecking the plane. At which point, he sheepishly climbed out. Neumann rushed out to find out what the hell the commotion was. And, well, it was the first proper blasting he had gotten since Macchi. And so, like Achilles in his tent, Jochen was forced to wait for his arm to heal. He was out of action for 2 weeks, listening to jazz, reading Der Adler and Signal, the German forces magazines. He was of course also getting letters from home. His fiancée Hannelise was eagerly awaiting their wedding, scheduled to take place later in the year. His mother, meanwhile, fussed over him and kept sending him food and other treats, which he shared with his comrades and his mechanics. Eventually, the medical officer cleared him to fly. However, he was slightly annoyed. Field Marshal Kesselring had ordered that the Gustav 109s be thoroughly tested in combat by Marseille in order to give Messerschmitt accurate data to refine the G10 and G6 prototypes he had flown and were currently being worked on at the time. Joachim didn't like the G, for the same reason the other Luftwaffe Experten didn't. It was heavier than the F4 and slower in acceleration. It performed worse overall. The only upgrade it presented was really better communication equipment, armoured glass for the pilot, and better high-altitude performance. But given that most air combat at that stage was on the Eastern Front and in the desert, aerial combat took place mostly at low level, and if you are attacking with height and with a speed advantage, the extra protection and heavy-duty gear really does nothing for you. Ostensibly, the newer engine was to compensate for that weight, but in reality it didn't. Joachim had since, along with the gang in Jagdgeschwader 52, who are at this time currently heading towards Stalingrad, decided to keep flying the F4. But orders are orders, and they needed test data. No one could know that it would end up costing them their greatest pilot. The engine in the 109G was the new DB605A model. Its design was focused on improving performance while maintaining full-scale production and circumventing production bottlenecks. One of those bottlenecks being ball bearings. When the American strategic bombing campaign began in 1943, there was a reason why ball bearing factories were a primary target. Realizing this weakness, the Germans experimented with standard slide bearings on the early models of the 605. But this, of course, increases friction by a significant degree, as there is no rolling surface, which, in a reciprocating engine, happens quite a lot, as one can imagine. The counter to this, of course, is high-quality alloys and good lubricants, in a country with an oil and special metal shortage. Yeah. And if the quality control on both counts is not up to standard, you now have a lot of moving parts, going at thousands of revolutions per minute, all of which contributing to or functioning from combustion, which generates heat. And all of it is generating excess friction during this operation, which also creates heat. Simply put, you're not just asking for, you are begging and pleading for an engine fire. And so, after recovering from his injuries, Joachim climbed into his Bf-109G2 on the 26th of September 1942, and he did precisely what he does best. That morning, he wanted to make up for lost time, and sure enough, the Desert Air Force made their appearance, as they always did. By now, the air war in Africa had turned decisively against the Germans. In fact, Marseille was actually a linchpin of the Luftwaffe air strategy, as his abilities were the only thing allowing Jagdgeschwader 27 to keep pace with the sheer volume of Allied aircraft now entering the battle. A whole wing of Hurricanes and Spitfires were performing close air support over the front line that day, and across 2 flights, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, Marseille shot down 7, including 1 Hurricane 2C, along with 6 Spitfire 5s. But after this latest triumph, his commander Neumann noted that even with all his rest for his injured arm, he looked exhausted. And so Joachim Staffel was rotated off operations for the next few days. And it was on the 28th of September, 1942, that the event I mentioned before this part of the story took place. The phone in the commander's office rang. Neumann answered, only to hear none other than Field Marshal Rommel ask if he could speak to Marseille. Naturally, he was quickly summoned. Rommel advised him that the Fuhrer had awarded him the diamonds to the Knight's Cross, and that he was to come with him to Berlin to receive the award, followed by a massive event at the Berlin Sportpalast. It was then, according to the first-hand account from Edward Neumann, that Marseille did something incredible. He turned down the award. He stated that he didn't want to receive the diamonds and that he was needed here with his comrades at the front. Besides, he wanted to save up all his leave days for Christmas so he could marry Hannelise and go on a proper honeymoon. We don't know why he refused the award. It could have been duty or modesty, though knowing Marseille I doubt it. My guess is he had personal reasons, most likely of a guilty nature. After the loss of so many of his friends in combat, and the revelations of his state's activities, such an award would probably feel so hollow it wouldn't mean anything. He couldn't know that not leaving for Germany the next day would end up costing him his life. On the 30th of September, Marseille and his flight took off on a routine patrol, intercepting a group of Spitfires far over enemy lines. His squadron mates engaged, however no opportunities presented themselves, and so Marseille and his flight turned course for home. As they did so, however, his 109 began smoking and losing power. Unsure what was happening, he reduced throttle to cruise speed. All of a sudden, the smoke got even worse. His cockpit began filling up with noxious fumes, blurring his vision to a critical extent while he struggled to breathe even with his mask on. Potgin flew alongside and guided Marseille to friendly lines, talking him through course changes and maneuvers until eventually they saw the large white mosque of Sidi Abel Rahman, confirming that they were now indeed in German-controlled territory. Marseille, feeling the aircraft losing power with the threat of a stall, unable to see and unable to breathe, decided to bail out of the aircraft and jettisoned his canopy. Potgin reported a huge cloud of smoke billowing out of the cockpit as Joachim turned the aircraft inverted and jumped into space. However, because he couldn't see his instruments or the horizon, he had not realized that during his roll he had entered a shallow dive. As he left the cockpit, he was snapped away by the slipstream and collided with the tailplane of his 109 at a speed of over 200 miles an hour. The left horizontal stabilizer slamming into his chest, knocking him unconscious, shattering his ribs, and stopping his heart. Unable to open his parachute, he impacted the desert sands at terminal velocity, ending the life of the greatest fighter pilot who ever lived. His comrades after landing immediately rushed to the crash site. The regimental surgeon who rushed to the scene after witnessing the bailout from the ground found Marseille's remains and immediately identified him after finding the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. He was laid to rest on October 1st at the Cemetery of Heroes in Deurne, overlooking the Mediterranean coastline. Field Marshal Kesselring and Edward Neumann delivered a eulogy to a funeral party of over 1,000 men. After his death, the effect on morale was devastating. Potgin was never really the same. It took him a long time to overcome the loss of his wingman. Matthias was assigned to another pilot, and true to their word, the squadron protected him from the Nazi hierarchy until they could sneak him into a prisoner of war camp to be liberated as they left Tunisia. Morale was bad enough that Jagerschwader 27 was rotated out on a month's leave in its entirety. And as per usual, despite his distaste for the regime and his intention to refuse the award, Goebbels ensured that Marseille was awarded the diamonds to the Knight's Cross posthumously, proclaimed a martyr in service for the new Germany. The world's finest fighter pilot, lost to the sands of Africa, in a war he never really wanted to be a part of. And despite his defiance and his victories, to this day he is largely forgotten. Only those in the historical and aviation communities know of him, and even then they don't know the full extent of his character or his life. The aces who survived the war, like Hartmann, Barkhorn, Krupinski and Galland, they get all the credit. And yet at the site of his crash, Italian engineers erected a pyramid in his honour. They wanted to recognize his achievements in battle, dedicated to his memory in the hope that he wouldn't be forgotten. And it remained there until 1989, when the surviving members of Jagerschwader 27, in cooperation with the Egyptian government, erected a more permanent memorial, perfectly carved and adorned with a plaque bearing his name and date of death. The epitaph, however, was comprised of a word. Just one singular word. A word worthy of his name and his deeds. Undefeated.